asked when I'm out speaking at the end when we do question and answers is, what Bible translation would I recommend? Sometimes it comes in various forms. What translation should I use? What translation should I give my friend who's a new believer? And ultimately, the question kind of comes up every single time regarding what's the best translation. So I figured I'd make a video just about Bible translations for everyone so you get an idea of not only what the purpose of them are, but that maybe I can answer that question for more people that might be watching this video or visiting the website that actually have the question. So go ahead and watch this presentation, and then I'm going to come back and expand on it just a little bit more. No matter what translation you're using, they all begin from the foundation of the existing Greek manuscripts. From there, most translations can be categorized into one of two areas: those that desire to express the original text in a word-for-word fashion, and those that seek to express the original meaning of the text in a more contemporary language. These two categories are often called formal equivalents, for the word-for-word, or functional equivalents, also known as dynamic equivalents. The more formal equivalents translations are the King James Version, the New King James Version, the NASB, and the English Standard Version. The more functional equivalence translations are the New International Version, or the NIV, the Net Bible, and the Amplified Bible. Now, all of the existing translations fall somewhere along this spectrum. It is a continuum, so there are translations that tend to operate somewhere in the middle, and there are extremes that lie on the outskirts of this spectrum. Paraphrase Bibles are a good example of extreme use of the functional equivalency approach. Undoubtedly, you see your preferred translation in one of these categories, and this diagram is not meant to place one translation over another, because both serve a valuable function. You might be thinking that the best way to know what was originally written is to have a verbatim, word-for-word translation from the Greek into English, but that's not always as effective as you might think. Greek and Hebrew are very dynamic languages, and often they express aspects of the words that cannot be directly translated into English. In some cases, idioms are used that don't make any sense in modern culture, and directly translating them only leads to confusion. Because of this, some translating committees have felt it best to translate the nuances of the original language as best they can, and convey the meaning of the passage without necessarily using the direct wording. In either case, we can be certain that what we read is consistent with what has been transmitted to the Church from its inception. We currently have more availability to the Bible than any generation has ever had before us, and this should be considered a blessing. To demonstrate how these differences can play out in your actual reading, observe how Acts 20:28 reads in the very popular, but older, formally equivalent King James Version. Now observe how the more recent, functionally equivalent New International Version renders the same verse. I've highlighted the most obvious difference in bold, and you can see that the King James Version translates the Greek word poimenein as feed, which is perfectly acceptable as it is a word that means the action of a shepherd. The New International Version has taken the same word and sought for clarity to translate it as be shepherds, to clarify what pastoral role is being described. Neither translation is incorrect, but both seek to communicate the same message in different styles. Another quick example is the translation of Ephesians 2, verse 1. It's clear that the King James Version has used a phrase that is not used in this verse in other translations. First, the term quickened is not used in modern English and has nothing to do with speed. In contemporary English, it would be rendered made alive. You'll also notice that the ESV rendering of the same passage uses clear language but doesn't contain the phrase quickened or made alive at all. This is because the actual word in the Greek text only appears in verse 5 of this chapter. The translators of the King James Version felt it would effectively combine the thoughts of Paul by transplanting that phrase into verse 1. The meaning and thought of Paul has not changed in either passage, but this demonstrates how these differences might appear. All right, so you've seen how the translations are made. We showed you the functional and formal equivalence of these translations and what the translators were looking to do with each one you see. Some of the things that aren't mentioned in that quick PowerPoint is paraphrase. And I mentioned that paraphrase was on the extreme end of the functional equivalency translation method. So paraphrase Bibles are Bibles that you see in the stores that are like the Message Bible or the Living Bible. Some would even argue that the New Living Bible or the New Living Translation would be paraphrases, and they are pretty close to that end of the spectrum. And the reason that they are on the extreme end of functional equivalency is because they go beyond simply trying to convey the meaning of the Greek or the Hebrew, but make it in such modern language that they often lose a lot of the nuance rather than expand on the nuance. So because of that, most people don't recommend paraphrase Bibles. Now, I don't recommend a paraphrase Bible for study. If you're going to do a Bible study where you want to learn more about the text, or if you want to grow a little bit more about the spiritual subtleties that are in there, or maybe deeper meanings of Paul, things like that, you're not going to get that in a paraphrase Bible. However, I will differ from a lot of my companions in this in saying that sometimes a paraphrase Bible is an excellent resource to see how it's conveyed as a cross-reference to what you're using in your translation. And sometimes a paraphrase Bible is a good resource to give to a friend who is either new to the faith or unfamiliar with the faith and has never seen a Bible before. And I say that because if you were to take something like the King James and the New King James and just give it to a new believer, oftentimes the wording is going to be so foreign to them, they're just going to put it down. So if someone is wanting to know more about the text from a completely naive standpoint, then a good paraphrase Bible might be a good idea. Again, like I said, that's only something to start with. You don't want to stay in that, and that is certainly not one to build a theology on, but they do serve their purpose. The other thing I want to discuss just briefly is that, as we said in the slideshow, you've probably seen your preferred translation on that matrix, whether it's the King James, the New American Standard, the NIV, the ESV, whatever it might be. Now, there are groups in the church today that believe that their particular English translation is the only one. And I just want to speak to that for a moment. There is one inspired text, and it is not an English translation. The inspired text is the original manuscripts, the original autograph, which would have been in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. So we cannot lay claim to an inspired English text. There are differences in each text, but those differences do not exist because some conspiracy has been placed upon the Word of God, because a translating committee has directly chosen to remove certain words or add other words, because that is not how this functions. There are means by which we can fact check every word in every English translation to see why and where each placement was made. And we must remember, when you start making phrases like, this translation took out this word because your translation has it and that translation doesn't. The one mistake you make when you make that statement is that you turned your English translation into the master copy by which all other translations have to meet. But your English translation is not the master copy. The Greek manuscripts, the Hebrew manuscripts, those are the master copy. So let's not forget that, because we are blessed, as I've said, we are blessed to have more English translations in our time in history than ever before. We could say that we don't even need another one. Really, honestly, we don't need another one. And with all of that, we have the words of God Himself transmitted from the beginning of time to now. And we can rely on those English translations to faithfully transmit that. But we don't want to take an opportunity of praise and blessing and turn it into an opportunity for pride and arguing with the brethren. So just keep that in mind. And I hope you've enjoyed this. Share it with anybody that might have that question. If you have questions, of course, you can contact us at the website, and I look forward to hearing from you. God bless.